Free Japan Channel, number 32. Today, May 26, 2024. The time is 7 p.m. here in Yokohama, so early summer night has begun. Dear listeners, how are you doing? I'm Matsumoto speaking. Today's FGC topic is Pacific War, the Battle of Midway. Have you ever heard of the Battle of Midway? Midway is the island, which is near from Hawaii Islands, and this was a very important military island for both the United States and for Japan. The Battle of Midway broke out in June 5th in 1942. Pacific War began with Pearl Harbor attack of Japanese Navy in 1941, December 8th, Japan time of course. So Midway broke out roughly 6 months after Pearl Harbor attack. And this time, Japanese Navy was more predominant than the US Navy. Especially the pilots of airplanes were superior here in Japan to those of the United States Navy. The Battle of Midway was the carrier's battle. Carrier means the military ship which carried airplane to attack the enemy. The first carrier attack was Coral Sea Battle, the Battle of Coral Sea, which was fought 1 month earlier than Midway. So Midway was the second match of carrier battle between the United States and Japan. At the time, Japanese Navy had 4 carriers, namely Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu. And US Navy had 3 carriers, Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown. Yorktown was severely damaged in the Battle of Coral Sea, but surprisingly, this carrier came to the Battle of Midway fixed with no more than 3 days. This was amazing damage control of the United States Navy. This can be imitated by all navies afterwards. But Japanese Navy still dominant because they had 4 carriers compared to 3 of the US Navy. But unfortunately for Japanese Navy, it had 2 missions. The first was the occupation of Midway, the attack of Midway Island. The second, if the task force of United States came, so carriers came, then Japanese task force should broke that US task force. These were 2 objectives of the Battle of Midway for Japanese Navy. And these 2 objectives made Japanese Navy so unskillful in the Battle of Midway. Japanese Navy should have focused on one aim, either the occupation of Midway or the battle against U.S. task force. But Japanese Navy task force had two purposes for the Battle of Midway. Then it was one of the reasons that Japan was defeated in this battle. Firstly, Japanese Air Force began to attack the Midway. It was about 6:30 Midway time, of course AM. So in the morning, Japanese airplanes assaulted Midway. But this attack was decoded and known to US Navy because Japanese code, which was complicated enough, was amazingly decoded by the intelligence agent in the United States. So the US Navy could prepare for the Japanese attack of Midway. So Japanese airplanes couldn't achieve the sufficient raid to Midway. So Japanese Navy tried to attack the Midway Island again. At this time, task force of Japan didn't discover the US task force, which were gaining on. On the other hand, US task force knew that Japanese carriers were approaching, and they were all ready for the best time for the attack. It was very wise of the commander of US Navy, this time Spruance, that he thought the best time was to attack Japanese carriers which were accommodating the attack airplanes of Midway. In general, carriers are most vulnerable when they were receiving airplanes. So airplanes were landing to the carriers. This is the most vulnerable time for carriers, and US Commander Spruance knew that well. So he thought the best time for US attack was the time Japanese raid airplanes returned to their own carriers. And he calculated that it was about 9 o'clock. Japanese attack on Midway broke out at 6:30, and it continued about 30 minutes. And Japanese planes, had to get back to their own carriers. So this is the best time for US carriers to return the attack to the Japanese carriers. And this calculation was to the point, was the best. And airplanes which took off 3 carriers, Hornet, US Enterprise, US Yorktown, and they attacked 3 carriers, namely Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Only Hiryu was a bit far from these 3 carriers, so it was safe from the attack of US bomb diver. Dauntless bomb diver were playing an important role in this attack. Before this dauntless attack, US torpedo plane, so Devastator, were repeatedly attacking Japanese task force, but they were all crushed by the Zero, so Japanese combat plane. So torpedo attack of the United States Navy was unsuccessful, but in the process, Japanese Zero were flying on the low altitude, and they were not aware of the dauntless divers which were approaching to Japanese task force from the high altitude. And then 10:20, so US attacks lasted more than 3 hours, and for these 3 hours, Japanese carriers were avoiding the attack of US airplanes, including bomb divers, of course, and torpedoes. So we should admit now that these Japanese admirals, who were operating these carriers, were so skillful, they avoided every attack of the US planes for more than 3 hours. But 10:20, the dauntless bomber were approaching and found 3 carriers below, and Zero were not approaching. So they could attack 3 carriers calmly. And this time, these pilots, US pilots, were so adept at dropping bombs. So Akagi got 2 bombs. Kaga got 4 bombs. And Soryu got 3 bombs from above. And immediately these 3 carriers were on fire because they were preparing for the next attack to the US carriers. So about 9 a.m., Japanese task force knew that the US task force was near from them. They didn't know the existence of US task force until 9 o'clock. So they were preparing for the second attack to the Midway Island. But this time, Japanese reconnaissance plane sent this message that it found the US task force, which included carriers, US carriers, and Japanese task force leaders were so shocked that the US carriers were so near from them, and they so hastily ordered that the bomb for the attack of Midway Island should be changed to torpedo because carriers could be damaged by torpedo, but not by bomb. So it took so much time for Japanese task force to be ready for the attack to the US carriers. And then 10:20, as I said, the bombs fell on them. And Hiryu was the only carrier who was free from the attack of the United States Navy, but it was also attacked late afternoon this day. But of course, Hiryu also launched the retaliation airplane force to the US task force, and they swarmed to Yorktown, carrier Yorktown. And Yorktown did sink because of this Japanese attack. Exactly speaking, Japanese submarine launched the torpedo afterwards, and it was a final attack for Yorktown. But anyway, Yorktown could not move by the attack of Japanese airplane. But Hornet and Enterprise was still operating, and these carriers launched the third attack to Hiryu, and then Hiryu also sank. Dear listeners, what do you think of this story of the Battle of Midway? First, Japanese task force changed their torpedo to island attack bomb, because they thought that the first attack was not enough. But soon after that, they discovered that the US task force was approaching. So they knew that the real attack was near. Second, they were about to launch the airplanes, but this time the bomb fell on their heads. It means Japanese airplanes were holding bombs, torpedoes, and it exploded simultaneously with the US attack. This was a fatal damage for the Japanese carriers. Third, Japanese code was deciphered in advance. Japanese admirals were all thinking that their code was so complicated and sophisticated that it wasn't broken, but it was broken by the intelligence agents in the United States. So, in this sense, US intelligence operation was so skillful. The Battle of Midway were complete defeat for Japanese Navy. Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers at the same time, including airplanes, bombers, and torpedo planes, and 3,000 crews. On the other hand, the US lost Yorktown, but the casualty was 300 maybe, so 1/10 of the casualty of Japanese Navy. And this Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. After this battle, US Navy began to erode Japanese territory gradually, and in 1943, the hegemony of Pacific War was totally in the hand of the US Navy. Thank you for listening.